Rick gave me a wonderful introduction to Bloomington, Normal, and McLean County yesterday and got to see a lot. My first up-close view, really up-close view of a giant wind turbine, which was fascinating, as well as a great tour of your neighborhoods. And I've been asked to talk about a lot. I have about 72 slides to share with you today. So if your head starts to hurt during the presentation, just kind of go like this, and I'll try to slow it down a bit. Or if you get bored, you can just sort of put your head on the table, and then I'll try to pick up the pace. This is our agenda. I'm going to talk about kind of where Raleigh was when it's my hometown. I was up in New York City for just shy of a decade, got my start in planning actually as a private consultant, which was a great way to learn a lot about a lot of different things, and then came back to my hometown of Raleigh in 2006 to be the Deputy Director of Planning under then Director Mitchell Silver, who's now the Parks Commissioner back in his hometown of New York City. And that was my first municipal job, and it was interesting to be having always been on the side of preparing the report and delivering it to the client and the municipality, and then going on my merry way and hoping they did something with it. Now the report was mine, and I had to do something with it, so it was an entirely different perspective. So we'll talk about kind of where we were and what was behind it, how we kind of set the stage and ran the public process. I'll give a brief overview of what's in the plan, but quite frankly, it's hard to summarize a 500-page binder of stuff, so I'll kind of keep that fairly high level. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've done in the years hence to try to implement that and close with some lessons learned. So the fundamental fact of planning that we deal with in North Carolina and throughout the Southeast is a historic migration of population to the Sun Belt, which turned in the space of half a century the land cover in the Southeast from this to that. And this is still ongoing. And this is Raleigh's historic population curve with the most recent date I have. You can see that we are very much a post-war city. Coming out of World War II, we were a relatively small town with a population of 51,000. And we're now at 432,000. And this is very much an exponential curve. And although we expect it someday to slow down, it has not slowed down as of yet. So one of the things is over 2/3 of Raleigh was built since 1980. So the place is mostly new. It's very different from many other cities. It's mostly new. These are our long-term population projections that we update every few years with our metropolitan planning organization. And they show us adding another 261,000 people to this total between 2010 and 2040. So we have another 62% of growth left, at least according to how we're projecting it. Our growth pattern has been extremely land consumptive. If you look at the period between 1950 and 2000 for the Research Triangle region, 480% growth in urban population, but a 1,670% growth in urban land area, over three and a half times as fast. This annexation map, until 2009, North Carolina had the most liberal annexation law in the country, and so growing cities gobbled up the territory around them. That was put to a halt by our General Assembly in 2010. But this is what our city limits looked like in 1907. In 1949, we sort of annexed the earliest inner ring suburbs that had been built on the northwest quadrant of the city, and by 2006, our city limits looked like this. So you can see how quickly in the 20th century our land area expanded. When redoing the planning researcher now in the University of Utah in Salt Lake City, ranked metro areas, we were number 3 in the country as the most sprawling based on measures of density, centeredness, mixed use, et cetera. One of the interesting things, though, is that Raleigh is remarkably diverse. We are a suburban community, but single-family dwellings are less than half of the total number of dwellings in the community. We have a very robust and diverse housing market, which is over a third multifamily and about 15% townhouse. We're situated within a county that the County of Wake, which includes 9 other municipalities. The second largest is Cary, and then we have relatively smaller places such as Fuquay-Varina, Holly Springs, Apex, all of which are also experiencing rapid growth. And the county has gone through and done a land use plan, and they've worked out agreements between all the municipalities as to who's going to annex what and what the eventual boundaries would be in a full build-out scenario of the county. And I remember stumbling across this map when I first got to Wake County, and I realized that implicitly what it was a plan for 100% urbanization of all the land area outside the drinking water watersheds on sewer and water and sewer service for the entire county. And the county's goal was actually to be out of the land use business sometime by 2030 and turn it all the land over to the counties, except for the low density areas that were in the two main drinking water reservoirs, which you can see the big one is Falls Lake up here. This one is proposed, doesn't exist, and there we have a supplementary supply in the southern part of the county. When we looked at our own land supply, we realized that there was still a fair amount left, but by around 2030, we would run out of greenfield development opportunities. So if the city was going to continue this growth trajectory, we'd have to start building up instead of out and start looking at infill and redevelopment as a bigger share of development activity within our city. One of the byproducts of being such a sprawling place is that even among auto-dependent cities, we are among the most auto-dependent in the country. You look at our single occupancy vehicle commute mode, about 80%, much higher than even sprawling Atlanta at 68%. And if you look at the number of miles per average per day driven by residents of Raleigh, it's 35 compared with, say, Portland, Oregon, where it's under 20. So we're a very car-intensive place. When we plug that type of behavior into our travel demand models and look at the arterial network going out, this is some maps that were prepared when we were doing the comp plan. It's pretty good today. We have some areas of congestion, but in the future it'll look like this. So that's all those red segments are the roads where the demand will exceed capacity, even putting in all programmed transportation improvements over that time. So this is an alarming vision of what the transportation system in the city will look like in the future under our current growth path. We also were looking very much at, during the time we were in a historic drought. This is our drinking water reservoir as it looked in 2007. So the brown areas are obviously areas that would normally be underwater, and then you can see how bad the situation got. We've been fortunate that since this time we came out of the drought, and now it's been quite wet, and so the groundwater supplies are replenished, and our surface water, which is where we get our water supply, is in pretty good shape right now. But this was a wake-up call because I think it was the first time the region ever stared in the face that its natural environment and its natural resources might put some sort of constraint on growth. They were just assumed always to be there, and all of a sudden we were coming close to running out of our most important natural resource, which was our water supply, and it started people thinking differently. This is a chart of per capita water consumption. You can see that between 2007 and 2008, we were able to drop per capita water consumption quite substantially, and that was due to emergency measures, bans on watering your lawn. But what's fascinating about this is that those good habits stuck, and even though there's plenty of water in the system today, we're actually, as the most recent year, using less water per capita than we were before. And unlike transportation, we're among the most efficient places in terms of water use in the country, and I think a lot of that owes to our newness and the newness of the appliances and water-saving toilets and other things that people have installed. So that's some background for what was going on when we did the comprehensive plan, and we'll talk about the process. One of the things that was interesting that got going a little bit before I came to Raleigh that Mitchell Silver started was a lecture series, because he felt like there needed to be a broader community conversation on urban issues. And it turns out it's surprisingly cheap to get really good planning experts to your town to give a talk. And it's a great way. There was a lot of community interest. Like I'm getting paid nothing other than that's because I'm a municipal employee. But for like $5,000, you can fly out some rock star professor and give them an honorarium and put them up for the night. And the first one we did was Donald Shoup, the high cost of free parking thing. And it was probably the best lecture I've ever heard. It was a really great lecture. But what was funny is at the time there was a debate. We were in the middle, sort of our downtown revitalization was just starting to get going. It's now wildly exceeded everyone's expectations, but it was very nascent at the time. And there was a debate going on, should we meter the parking spaces on street or not? And the mayor was totally opposed to it. And he didn't attend the lecture. Donald Shoup feels that, yes, you should use pricing to allocate a scarce resource, parking, to the people who want it the most. But he watched the videotape of it, and then he totally reversed himself, and then we ended up metering the downtown streets, and it's worked out very well. So it shows that a good lecture can actually have a real impact on public policy. We had a number of other ones, and always got really good turnouts, and it really was a valuable and low-cost way to start raising issues and getting them into the dialogue. The actual planning process that we implemented, I like to think of it as having two parallel tracks. One is a technical track. which is all the background research, data collection, projections, et cetera. And then there's a civic engagement track, which is all the workshops and things that you run as part of a planning process. Talking to Vazu, it seems like you guys are very good at getting a lot of public participation in your processes here in McLean County. Technical track, there were two main documents that came out of that. Our old comp plan was a beast, and there was all these sort of planning documents that had been adopted over the years but never really properly cataloged. So we went and extracted every policy statement into a giant spreadsheet, and there were like 5,000 adopted policies that dealt with growth and development, and we went through all of them, decided whether they were still relevant or not, and decided which ones to carry forward in the comp plan and which ones to retire. And then we also did a big community inventory report that was full of all sorts of charts and tables and projections and data, et cetera. And one of the things we've done is there was an enormous amount of work to create that, so we've slimmed it down into a data book which we update every year so that we're able to make sure that we're staying current with trends. And then there was a formal, very formalized process for the civic engagement process that was started with a kickoff event and kind of went through a series of 3 rounds of 3 workshops that we rotated to various locations throughout the city. The first one was to sort of define the vision and values for the plan. The second one was to explore policy options, and the third one was more of an open house format to present the draft. We had some specific workshops on the elements. When we put the public review draft out to the public, we used a software product that was available at the time that would allow online commenting on the document. We got about 1,200 comments against the original draft. We held a public hearing, and then there was the usual public process to adopt it. There was also an informal process. I talked about the lecture series. We did a lot of small-scale workshops because I had a lot of people come up to us and say, oh, my group would like to talk about the comp plan. And so my response to that was the answer was always yes. If you would provide, we didn't have time to do the logistics, but if you gave us a room with people in it, we would show up at your meeting with maps and markers and flip charts and run a workshop with you. And there were 2 great things about that, one of which was we were able to get some extra input, but it was also the other thing was that just saying yes to the meeting often satisfied the need, and then there never was any meeting. I had about half the groups that asked for a meeting. When I said, yeah, give us a meeting, just set up a meeting and we'll be there, they never got back to us. So that ended up being very efficient with staff time. We also had 2 we wanted to make the process fun, so we had 2 events that were cooked up to kind of get people engaged in a different way. One of this was this idea of Big Ideas Week, and it was like a series of 4 meetings throughout the week where the charge was to cook up outlandish ideas for the future of Raleigh. And the signature event was actually held at a local tavern where we had people in the bar, some of them having beverages, cooking up ideas for Raleigh. I don't know if you can see this sign. It doesn't read here. It's the Tiernanog was the name of the club, and it says, "Welcome Urban City Planers." We also did a Kid City event at the Marlborough's Children's Museum downtown, and this was a lot of fun. Basically, we got a bunch of scrap cardboard and boxes and paper and stuff and glue and tape and scissors, and we laid out a grid on the floor of the main atrium in the museum, and kids would go and they would get a zoning permit and they would get construction materials and they would build a building. And there were 2 lessons. The children really liked factories. They really liked to build factories. There was a candy factory, and they liked to build tall buildings. The kids were all about the height. They really liked to. There was a race going on between 2 to see who could put up the biggest skyscraper. So. No NIMBYism in Kid City. So all told, we had about 57 public meetings prior to ever taking the document to public hearing, and that's a listing of them. And we wrote them all up. Probably went overboard documenting everything, but it was my philosophy that if you're going to ask people to take time out of their busy schedule or away from their families to come to your meeting, you owe it to them to get back to them. Did their comments make any difference? So every time we tried to distill it all down, and we wrote up a report that said this is what we're going to do to reflect the comment that we heard. We also did the same thing with the approximately 1,200 comments that we got registered online and through other means against the public review draft of the document. A lot of them were in support, a lot of observations. There were some objections, some other comments. We would track every one of them. I have a spreadsheet still of all of these. The initial comment, which would be listed verbatim. So they were against something. So here's a policy statement. There was a comment that said, can you add something about promoting interconnectivity to this? There was an initial staff response, and then there was a resolution, which is whether or not we edited the plan. So in this case, we made a small text edit to the plan, and so, if this person ever asked me, what did you do with my comment? I could say, well, we added the words "and well connected" after compact to this sentence as a direct result of your comment. So no one ever read any of this stuff, I don't think. I mean, maybe a few people looked at it, but the fact that it existed meant that we had been fully accountable to the public, and that I could stand up with a straight face in front of my city council and say, we listened to people and we made 450 discrete text edits to the plan as a result of these comments, and if you want to look it up, here it is. When we were done with that process, we only had 4% objective comments that were not resolved in some way by a change to the plan. So you can see the vast majority of comments we got on the plan were very much in support, and that this, of course, was of great help during the adoption process and making sure that went well. The actual contents of the plan, I think, is a fairly traditional organization. The old plan had been mostly area plans. The new plan is mostly citywide elements, but we did have to retain some of these old area plans that certain neighborhoods were very vested in. It has 13 elements that are at the core of it. Each element contains the policies and actions of the plan. It's a big document. I mean, it's longer personally than I would have liked it to be, but it's a lot shorter than what it replaced, and we were, felt like we couldn't throw the whole thing out. So that's one of the reasons why. And it's gotten shorter over time as we've ticked action items off of our list. And it had an implementation element that talked about how the plan should be implemented and how it would be kept current over time. This vision statement came out of that first round of public workshops. So to me, vision statements, it's hard to tell. They're very much the same from community to community. We like to think of ourselves as being an innovative, creative, and technically savvy type of place because of our growth around Research Triangle Park and being a great, attractive place with a lot of parks and open space. The Southeast is not a dramatic natural setting, but stuff grows there like crazy. So if you want lush greenery, it's a great place to live, and so the trees, the gardens, the forest, that's what makes it a beautiful place. And so we try to preserve that. There's a big emphasis on tree conservation in our community and maintaining that tree canopy. And we had these 6 themes, and these 6 themes became the goals of the plan, and there's some narrative in the plan that kind of gives some explaining, but they're a lot what you would think. We're talking about having a healthy, thriving economy, having choices in the housing market, trying to bring growth management, which is a challenge in North Carolina because there's no enabling authority for it, so it's all carrots and no sticks. Coordinating land use and transportation investment, putting this idea of a green print, like really mapping what are our critical natural resources and trying to protect those for development, primarily through a land acquisition strategy. And then this idea that we're growing, and every neighborhood has to do part of its part to accommodate that growth. We can't wall ourselves off from all these newcomers that are moving to our community, but we want to leverage that growth to make our neighborhoods better over time. And the structure was to flow from vision, policy, and action. So the 6 vision themes are the goals. Each policy statement references one of those. Those are those little numbers at the end of the policy statement. And then action items were added to be actual checklists to do things that would implement the policies. So we have a policy about land use and transportation, or a goal for that. We have a policy on connectivity, and then we have an action that says we should write connectivity standards into our development code, which we actually did. There were 2 big maps. There were lots of maps in the plan, street map, transit map, all this kind of stuff. This growth framework map was our illustration of how the city might recenter its growth as a multimodal set of centers and corridors. So the big gray things were sort of multimodal corridors. They would form the potential backbone of a more frequent transit grid. And we have a regional center downtown, and then sort of growth centers centered at some major suburban conurbations in the city. And the idea was to put 60% of new growth into these centers and corridors, which was an ambitious goal since historically most of it had been at the urban fringe. And to operationalize that, we created a new land use plan for the city. The city had never had a land use plan, so this was drawn mostly from scratch. We did have some area plans that had land use recommendations, but we had to create the categories and we had to draw it for the whole area, which is 181 mile square planning jurisdiction. Our city limits are a subset of that. I had 25 people working on this for about 8 months, drawing it up with a sort of a guidance document. Went through a lot of refinement. It's worked well. I still occasionally find stuff in there like, what were we thinking when we mapped that light industrial? But we continue to clean it up, and generally we got a lot of it pretty right, and it's served us very well. I don't know how some communities and some states rezoning is a big part of what planning departments do. In New Jersey, like nothing's ever rezoned. We do about 40 to 50 rezoning petitions a year. So every one of them has to be tested against this map for consistency or inconsistency. I think of a comp plan as having 4 major vectors or avenues through which it's implemented. You want to make sure that your development regulations are aligned with the policies of your plan and your land use plan. You want to coordinate your capital improvement programs, that you're investing in the areas that you are trying to stimulate growth in. You want to have the adopted policies should guide the discretionary decisions made by your elected and appointed officials, whether that's rezonings or changes to the ordinance or discretionary development approvals like special use permits. And then you want to make sure your organization is aligned. Are the action items on departmental work programs, are departments collaborating around the plan? Does our organizational structure reflect what we're trying to achieve? And so all of these things are important, and one of the things we do that I talk about is we check ourselves every year. We do a progress report on these topics every year as to how we're doing on them. Probably the big thing that was done started up before the comp plan was even done, was to start a major overhaul of our development code. And the zoning code, the new urbanists like to talk about it as the DNA of our cities. But it has a major impact on how stuff is developed. And our code hadn't really seen a comprehensive update since the 1950s, and it had all this stuff tacked onto it. I mean, I used to know the New York City zoning code, and ours was harder to find stuff in than that code was. And the New York City code was a 3-volume document, but just in terms of organization and the way it had been patched and altered, it was very difficult to deal with. If the layperson picking it up wouldn't even know where to begin with it. So what were we trying to do? We were trying to fix what we saw as 3 big problems with our development code. One is that it was context-free. The regulations didn't really vary, whether you're on an old pre-war pedestrian main street or an arterial suburban. The standards for road right-of-way and road treatment and streetscape and building form and massing were basically the same. There was no context. And so we created these overlays to try to actually allow development that fit with the context to occur, because the base districts had all prohibited it. The second one was that because the standards in the code weren't very good, the City Council relied a lot on discretionary review, and as a result spent an excessive amount of their time approving development plans and projects. And we wanted to substitute good standards in the code and move to an administrative review process for that. And then there was a basic incompatibility with the suite of zoning districts we had and those categories we'd drawn up in the land use map. So we wanted to make sure that those were aligned. So among the tools we did, it's not a form-based code, but it has form-centric elements in it. It has to apply to a very diverse landscape of 181 square miles. But it has some good innovations. I'll cover a few. One is building types were defined. There's 8 of them, including open lot. But this allows us to draft within the same district different standards for townhouses than we would have, say, for single family, or different standards for apartments than we would have for townhouses. We basically threw out all the commercial districts that were in the code and created a new suite of mixed-use districts. The residential zones were mostly unchanged. From 1 to 10 units per acre, that type of zoning was mostly unchanged. We did some tweaks to the dimensional standards. We had carried forward some of our special zoning districts, like agriculture and planned development, and then we have some overlay districts. We were able to get rid of about a third of our overlay districts, but some of them are special purpose, like the airport overlay. We had to carry forward. I won't go through all of these, but some of them are character protection, like neighborhood conservation. Of course, we also have historic overlay districts, and we added a new one for neighborhoods that didn't want a full bore preservation program, but wanted something that would have some design review. It's the only legal avenue for design review in North Carolina's historic zoning. So we created what we call the street side historic overlay, which basically only regulated what you could see from the street, but you could do whatever you wanted in the back of the house. Hasn't been applied yet. We have one neighborhood that's interested. The mixed-use districts you can assign specific heights from 3 to 40 stories for buildings. They did away with residential density and with floor area ratios. So basically building height is the only way that the code regulates intensity. That's part of the form-based playbook. And then we also created this new tool called frontages, which was an optional element that could be attached to a mixed-use district to regulate how buildings related to the street. And we had 3 suburban frontages. One is Parkway. It says give us 50 feet of landscaping and trees, and you can do whatever you want behind it. Parking limited was sort of a hybrid approach. Says we would like the buildings to be at least within 100 feet of the right-of-way, but you can put some parking in front of them. And then we have 4 urban frontages that are designed for more intense mixed-use areas. They basically mandate that the building be up close to the front of the property. They also give you a very generous parking reduction, which has been necessary for some of the denser development types that have gone in to make them economically viable. We also put in our first controls for height and massing for tall towers, which is something we'd never had. So we're deviating from the Chicago model, where it's very sheer towers, to at least have one step back when you're building something over 12 stories. And then we adopted a whole suite of new street cross sections. And these started in the UDO. They've been put into our street design manual and incorporated to the comp plan. But we have everything from rural roads with drainage swales to very urban main streets incorporated into this. And we've greatly expanded the use of bike facilities. Most of the road networks we have do call for a bike facility. So as new development comes in or new roads are built in development, that'll be a part of how everything is structured. And we adopted a whole map, redrew the entire street map for the city to implement these cross sections. It's kind of unreadable, but in big format, you can see that in that little legend up here, every one of those street cross sections is somehow mapped on one of these existing streets. So all new development in terms of right-of-way dedication has to come in for this. What am I doing? Probably the other major change was Raleigh has terrible street connectivity, and that was one of the things we wanted to fix. And we put in a block perimeter standard, which says when you're subdividing land, a block, which is defined as any assemblage of land that's surrounded by right-of-way, can only be so large. And this is probably, in my opinion, the thing that will change development patterns in the city the most, because new developments will have a lot more streets in the new code than they have today. This is an example of one of the first large-scale mixed-use projects. This is near North Carolina State University on their historic main street of Hillsborough Street. Completely administrative approval, was rezoned first to a UDO district, then it was able to come through development plan approval and go from initial plan submission to building permits in about 6 months. So that was a good timeline for us. And this is a rendering, but it'll be complete this summer and leasing up for the fall. We had all these new zoning districts, and we have to put them on the map. So one of the major things that we've been doing for the last couple years is a remapping effort, and this shows all the areas that are proposed to be changed in terms of zoning. It's about 1/3 of our land area, so it's about 60-some square miles. We have a process that started with actually putting a proposal together, translating the old districts into the new districts using a guidance document that we got approval from council for. We've mailed everyone. We had a public review period, then we brought it to Planning Commission with all the assembled comments. They've been churning through the comments. They just finished doing that 2 days ago. Next Tuesday, they'll be reporting it out to City Council. We're eventually going to take it to a formal public hearing with another mailed notice, and we're posting I think several hundred signs all over the city as to meet the posted notice requirements, and then they'll eventually adopt it. In order, as you imagine, rezoning so many people potentially could have gone very wrong or been very controversial, so we had a 3-pronged strategy for how we were going to do it. The first is we were going to have a reassuring postcard that was going to be written in very plain language saying, yes, we're doing this thing to you of rezoning your property, but here's how you can learn about it, here's where you go, here's a number you can call to talk to a human, here's how you can be a part of the process, we want to hear what you have to say, and we want you to help us get it right. The second was a great website that made it super easy to research what was the difference between the existing zoning and the proposed zoning for anything, and our IT staff just did this amazing job of putting this thing together. And then we actually hired call center temps and staffed up a call center with 6 phones in some unused cubicles in our office, which was critical because if you're hot under the collar and you get a voicemail, that's not really a good thing. So we made ensured that everyone who called got a human on the phone the first time. And it turned out most people just had generic questions, and using a script, the call center people could ask it. If people had a more technical question, we would get back to them with professional staff in about 48 hours. This is the postcard. First sentence is, you have received this postcard because the City of Raleigh proposes to rezone your property, and the second sentence is, don't panic. We did have one comment that says, who are you to tell me not to panic? We only got one comment like that. And it has the website, and it has the phone number and other stuff on it. So worked pretty well. This is a screenshot of the website. You type in any address, and it gives you existing zoning and proposed zoning on either side of this with a description of what the existing zoning is and what the proposed zoning is like. So this made it super easy, and I mean, I use this all the time actually when people ask me questions about it, to see exactly where we were and where we were going, side by side. Super simple. All you have to do is know a street address, and the website does the rest. And you can put a push pin on it, virtual push pin on it, and attach a comment to that. So here's a comment on this. You know, we had people asking for something different than what we proposed. We tracked all of them. They all went into a database. We responded to all of them. We took the Planning Commission. There were a lot of comments that were just comments, random comments, but there were about 311 that were actual changes to take a zoning district on a property from this to that, and the bulk of the Planning Commission review was doing that. They just finished up, and we made about 100 changes in round numbers to the map as a result of that Planning Commission review. I've heard from the city councilors, they're ready to get this done, so we're expecting them to adopt it after about a couple months of review. I showed earlier that map of where is growth occurring, where we wanted growth to occur. So one of the things we've done, we're in the middle of a 5-year update, is to look at, well, did we meet our goal? This is a map of where rezonings went against that growth framework map, and most of the rezonings have actually been on a corridor or in one of these designated centers, so that's pretty good news. We also looked at building permit data against the map and found out that looked in terms of value and dwelling units that we were actually exceeding the goal. Over 60% of the building permits pulled since the adoption of the comp plan had actually been in those areas. So we've been very fortunate. And part of the reason for that is that the thing that led the building industry out of the recession in our community, like many communities, has been apartments. You know, in 2012 and 2014, about 3/4 of building permits for residential were multifamily apartments. Single family has not really seen a huge amount of growth coming out of the recession. In our town, some of the outlying towns, that's a different story. And we've had this big urban apartment boom. We never had rental buildings with parking garages, but we have a lot of them now. About 2,000 units have been built since the recession. Another couple thousand are in the pipeline. We'll probably have about 5,000 new units on the ground by 2016. Most of which have been clustered in the downtown area. Out Hillsborough Street near the university, and then in mixed-use centers like North Hills. You know, there was a radical reordering in Raleigh in a period of about a decade of where the most valuable land was. This is a 3D map of property assessments per acre, so it's normalized per acre. You can see downtown Raleigh stands out pretty heavily. This is North Hills, which is a major suburban mixed-use center. This is our shopping mall. But these close in-town neighborhoods saw their property values between 2000 and 2008 increase by 150%. So they more than doubled compared to a countywide average of 40% during the same period. So all of a sudden people wanted to be close to the center of things, and it's created a whole new development environment from what we used to see, and the growth pressures in these neighborhoods are creating a lot of development battles that didn't used to exist because people were always developing on farms. The other thing that's interesting is obviously the creation of the Research Triangle Park, which was conceived of in the 50s and really got cooking in the 60s when they managed to get IBM to come to North Carolina. It was predicated on this extremely expansive, low-density tree-lined campus with single users, with building their own special purpose buildings with laboratories and other things in them, which was a great model. I mean, it transformed this area from a tobacco backwater to a center of technology, leveraging the one asset that we had, which was 3 major research universities at the 3 corners of the Triangle region. But it turns out that this model for some of the newer technology industries is falling out of fashion, and we're seeing major technology employers such as Red Hat, an open source software services firm, and Citrix, who bought a local company, ShareFile, and expanded in our region, moved to downtown Raleigh. And why did they move to downtown Raleigh? Because they asked their employees, where do you want to be? They said, we want to be downtown. We want to walk to the coffee shop. We want to see our friends on our lunch hour. We want to be in an active environment. And so the park is actually now retooling its master plan to create its own mixed-use center. They're calling it Park Center, to help satisfy some of that demand of people shifting away from the research campus. We tracked all our action items. There are about 500 and some in the plan. We've fully implemented about a third of them, so we've got till 2030. That's not bad. We've got another about half in progress and only 17% that haven't been started. And then there's 5% where I couldn't get the department head to answer our questions as to what was going on. Getting out of time, we've also I talked about the green print and that thing. We've been steadily adding to our Greenway network, which is one of our signature things. Our open space plan is all about riparian corridors. That's what is sensitive in our area. So we have, and the biggest achievement was the Neuse River Trail, which opened, but we now have over 100 miles of Greenway trails in our community. I understand you are also building a very expansive Greenway network. It's a wonderful amenity. A lot of people are marketing it. Probably the most amazing example was in Atlanta, the Beltline. There's now people selling houses. The company's called Beltline Realty, and everywhere a house is for sale near this Greenway loop they're building for the city, that's the marketing hook. Live near the Beltline. So these trails are increasingly starting to drive real estate values. We've also looked at, we have a new city manager as of a couple of years ago, looked at how planning functions used to be spread against all these different departments and try to come up with a better organizational alignment. So basically, my department is evolving into a purely policy shop that also includes zoning, while development services is going to be the permitting and plan review shop, which is going to be a separate department. And then we also have an economic development arm, all reporting up to the same assistant city manager. I'm almost done. The biggest hole in our planning has been transit planning for our region. And quite frankly, we have probably one of the worst. Well, it's not as bad. I think as Oklahoma City has the worst bus system in the country for a metro of its size. But we're in the bottom of the barrel in terms of what we're providing for the transit riding public. Yet we've been cooking up multi-billion-dollar rail plans for 15, 20 years, none of which have ever been implemented. So I think right now we're involved in what I consider the first really reality-based exercise, and it started with a lecture. I brought Jarrett Walker under the auspices of Urban Land Institute, who's a transit consultant out of Portland, to give a talk, and it changed a lot of people's mind about what it would mean to provide meaningful transit service. We were going to have to focus a lot more on buses rather than big capital projects. And we've now hired him, along with the team, with Kimley Horn, a locally based engineering firm, to redo our whole regional transit plan, and it's going to be wrapped up this year, and we're going to go out for a sales tax referendum next year. So I hope we have a compelling document that we can put in front of the voters. But this is the first time I think that we're really getting to where we need to be if we're going to make transit a bigger part of the transportation mix, which we need to do as our city continues to densify. We're also in the middle of a process of a 5-year update of the comp plan. We said we would do this in one of our policies, that we'd re-examine it, see if we needed to make any course corrections based on changes and trends in the data. We're doing a lighter weight community input. It turns out most people are pretty happy with the plan. When people are happy, they tend to stay home instead of turning out for meetings. But we're getting some attendance out and having some good discussion. We're checking in on the vision themes. Are they still relevant? How are we doing? And we're also trying to make sure we're in the cutting edge of best practices. And there's this publication that just came out from APA under their Sustaining Places program about best practices for comprehensive plans. And we were a test case community looking at these principles, processes, and attributes. They have a huge scoring matrix, and we scored our plan against it. And although we generally scored quite well, we uncovered a few weak spots. So one of the things we're doing is looking to address those weak spots in this update. So I'll close with a few brief lessons learned, and then I'll take your questions. One is that if you want to be serious about your public process, it's an enormous amount of staff overhead and work, but it's worth it, in my opinion, to do it that way. It's important to set clear expectations for both how you're going to run the process and what the plan is and isn't going to accomplish, what kind of content it will have, and then stick to them to maintain credibility. I mean, people ask, a lot of us have asked, how did you pull off this remapping? Which we've almost pulled off, not quite, but we're this close. Part of it was saying, we're doing this. Here's the timeline. We want you to be part of the process, but we're not holding up the train. You have to get on the train when it stopped at the station. And telegraphing that was very important to keeping all of these major undertakings, the comp plan rewrite, the code rewrite, the remapping, on track. Otherwise, if you let the process get interrupted or delayed, you've basically lost the game. So it's very important to set those expectations and stick to them. I think a plan has to have a vision in it, but it also needs to work backwards from implementation. Are you promising things that you can't deliver because you don't have the legal authority to deliver them or you don't have the capacity to deliver them? That's putting false promises in your document, and that's not a favor to anyone. So we always scrutinized everything that was in the plan. Is this something that we could actually do? Can we actually implement this policy? Can we actually do this action? And if not, my inclination is to take it out. And as part of our annual reporting, we have taken out action items because we decided upon further review that we couldn't do the thing that we said we were going to do. And we just felt like it was honest to go ahead and say, we're taking it out of the plan. Track progress annually is very important. And the last thing is, put the plan in a binder. You're going to have to update it. And I've seen some really great plans like Austin, Texas. I don't mean to rag on them, but I mean, they have this beautiful plan, but it's published like a book. Which means that 5 years from now, all the data is going to be out of date. All the stuff's going to be a little out of date. And how are they going to refresh it? They have to republish the whole thing. It's very expensive. The binder, you want to update it, you can take pages out, put new pages in. Your plan is not the Bible. It's a living, it's a document that's going to be revised every year. It's going to be amended, tweaked. Be comfortable with that. Put it in a binder so you can easily keep it up to date. So that's all I've got, so I'm happy to take any of your questions.
What we're going to do is go ahead, if you have any questions, please come to the mic stand here and go ahead and ask.
Question, you mentioned that there's 21 area plans.
Yes.
As part of this. Could you comment a little on that? Because what I found is, sometimes people are more interested in, well, what's just going to happen in my neighborhood if there's some undeveloped land or undeveloped land. So comment on, your view of these area plans and how much progress you've made on those for some of these smaller areas, which people sometimes relate more to than such a large area as the entire city of Raleigh.
Okay, the area plans were a legacy that we inherited that, quite frankly, a lot of them were not very useful. We had 79 in the old comp plan, and we whittled the number down to 21. In terms of implementation, the track record historically had been quite poor. I mean, I was pulling stuff out of plans that were 15 years old, and people didn't even know what was in there. There were capital projects identified, never shown up on the CIP in over a decade. So we also, they were written kind of in this rambling narrative style, so it's hard to tell what the specific policies were. So we rewrote them, we condensed them, we kept 21 of them. And they're definitely, if there's a rezoning in an area plan, then we definitely reference the policies of that area plan as part of that rezoning review. We've put the action items into our action item matrix, and if there's specific capital projects, we're trying to get those into the CIP. All area plans we've done since then have not gone in the comp plan. There are no new ones. They've been freestanding documents, and we've amended the citywide maps. Like if someone proposes a new street alignment or a change to the future land use map as a result of an area plan, we put that in there. There is the question as to what if there is area-specific guidance that's relevant for rezoning. Does that have to go into the comp plan or not? I'm grappling with this right now, and we're exploring some options about actually taking the area plans out of the comp plan and having it as a separate volume. But we haven't made a final decision on it. The area planning is tremendously important because you can get at a detailed level, and I think it is important. People are looking for some of these area plans with the new UDO to set specific building heights. So we're going to say on this street nothing can be taller than 4 stories. And if you're asking for 5, you're inconsistent with the plan. So that's got to be part of the zoning process going forward. Or we're just going to go in, one of the goals with the code was to have a zoning code where the city could go in and do the remapping to implement the land use recommendations on the back end of the area planning process. So we have not, we are implementing some of those through the citywide remapping where we had an area plan that was specific enough about zoning or building height. We've basically taken that guidance verbatim and put it into the map. Our new ones, we haven't yet done a full-bore city-initiated rezoning to implement an area plan, but we might with a couple that we have underway. Shirley, there's something, yes?
I was wondering, regarding the mapping and the rezoning, you had specific recommendations from the committee. Were they, I would like to know some of them, just really briefly, and were they a result of the anticipated economic development, anticipated new populations of what kind?
You know, largely the remapping was an act of translation. And the reason is it was 35,000 parcels. So if we were going to make a planning judgment decision on every one of them, we'd be wrapping this up in 2020. So we did not see it as an opportunity to implement a lot of new policy. So we relied on adopted policy, adopted area plans, built context, and what the current zoning was. So it's not a visionary thing at all. It was a conservative translation to the best of what we could of current zoning to new zoning. And the major principles were don't make people non-conforming, don't diminish their development potential, because we didn't want a bunch of angry people out saying, what are you doing to me? Don't touch the residential districts for the most part. Most of the single family homeowners are held harmless in this. So we're mostly dealing with income producing property. And so we're having a conversation with people who are interested in, is this good for future income or not, which I think is a easier discussion to have. So no, it's not a visionary thing. In some cases, where we had area plans that were recent that talked about greater height, we increased building heights. Everywhere else, the kind of default thing was it's 3 stories. Unless there's something telling me it ought to be taller, like a tall building that's already there, or a plan that says it ought to be tall.
Anybody else happy to come to you?
I'm curious about how can it affect the real estate tax assessments?
It hasn't yet. Nothing's been revaled since 2008. The Wake County does it every 8 years. I did get that question a fair number of times, and of course the fact of the matter is I don't know. There's different ways of assessing property. You can look at comparable sales, you can do the income approach, you can look at it in terms of what the development yield is in the future. Obviously, if we up the development yield, your taxes might go up, but you also have an asset that's more valuable than it was before. So it's a double-edged sword. What I tell people is that, the county, there's 2 things driving the assessment. There's what is the overall appreciation of value within the county on average, and then is your property becoming more valuable on average than other people's is. So your taxes are only going to go, we typically, being a fiscally conservative place, when the reval happens, they reset the tax rate at a lower level in order to keep it revenue neutral. So if your property gained less value than the average, your taxes go down. If your value gained the same amount of value as the average, your taxes stay the same. And if it gained more value than the average, then your taxes go up. And that's the price you pay for having a property that's more valuable than other people's property. So we're actually about to go into another reval year in 2015. The results will be on the tax rolls in 2016, assuming they don't lose their nerve, which would be a bad thing to do because if you don't keep your assessments up to date, it's like a slippery slope, and you end up like Yonkers, New York, that didn't reval from 1972, and their tax system is just unalterably broken, and they don't know how to fix it. So it's important to keep that stuff current.
Okay. Anybody else? You?
I would also say North Carolina property taxes are a pittance because we fund most education out of state income tax. The combined city-county rate is like 0.9%. So if you own $1 million house, you pay a $9,000 tax bill. If you were in New Jersey, you'd pay a $30,000 tax bill.
How do you coordinate your planning with Chapel Hill and Durham, or do you compete like you do in basketball?
Well, we were, Chapel Hill is its own thing that's different from the rest of the triangle in terms of how it's governed. Durham, Raleigh has been a boom town. Durham wants to be a boom town, and Chapel Hill wants to keep that boom as far away as possible and sort of stay as it is. Although it actually has changed a lot in the last 10 years too. Whereas before, you could, if you'd gone to school there in the 60s and shown up in the 90s, you would have recognized the place as looking almost identical as when you left. You know, the coordination is lacking. I mean, we have a good regional council of governments, does a lot of convening, there's a lot of talking. We actually have 2 MPOs, which is silly. The largest cross-county commute in North Carolina is between Wake and Durham counties, and they're in 2 different MPOs. I'd argue that we should have 1 MPO, but there's this cultural divide that doesn't seem to be able to be bridged. I mean, they do coordinate transportation planning. We were trying to coordinate regional transit. I think that we're actually in a worse place than we were before, because when the sales tax authority was granted in 2009, Durham and Orange County, where Chapel Hill is, went out for referendum right away, and they won both referendums handily. And there had been basically, and Wake County had a very conservative county commissioners at the time, and they were not going to put a transit referendum on because they were ideologically opposed to the very idea of having transit. So they said, you know, we're going to ignore Wake, and we're going to do our transit plan for just Durham and Orange and pretend like Wake doesn't exist. And now Wake has had a change of leadership, very enthusiastic about getting a referendum forward, but as a result, Durham and Orange are very advanced in their plans, and the region's not going to connect up as a result unless they end up having losing federal funding for their major project and having to retool what they're doing.